This video is sponsored by Surfshark. You know what? Considering that we all feared that this would happen, it turned out it didn't. The Imola Grand Prix wasn't boring at all. So you know what? I'm feeling frisky, I'm gonna say it. The Formula 1 AWS Gran Premio del Made in Italy e dell'Emilia Romagna. There! And just like me, Max Verstappen absolutely nailed it. He starts off the winners sections by taking a commanding win at Imola, but what stood out most was how he seized the lead right at the start, because he didn't just wait for an opportunity, he just willed one into existence. And I could tell on social media that nobody could be mad at that overtake. There were no conspiracies of sabotage or robbed or anything like that. No, that was a clean move. Bravo. And then that, of course, that was exacerbated by the two safety cars in that he got a cheeky pit stop and he was one of the main beneficiaries after being one of the most tragic victims of the virtual safety car last time out in Miami. And then what also helped is that McLaren chose to wash their hands of team orders and just allowed their drivers to sort it out amongst themselves, leaving Norris taking 3 laps or so to pass Piastri on older tyres, and that gave Max, I think, about 4 seconds of a lead. Had McLaren unleashed team orders, Norris might have had a slightly better chance, but Max was in control throughout. And it means that he has now closed the gap to Piastri to just 22 points, and this was a big result, not just for that points haul, but for the psychological impact as well. Because Red Bull and Verstappen, they may actually be headed back to somewhere where they can actually mount a championship challenge again. Sure, it might not be the magic bullet that gets them past the McLarens, but they figure again. At their 400th Grand Prix as well, so it was extra special. And it was extra special seeing the old numbering font again for the first time since, I think, 2013 or something like that. And also, I think a lot of people are going to be extra relieved that this season isn't going to become a McLaren domination school. We might be back on for a really interesting second act, people. And you know what? Considering how terrible Saturday was for Ferrari and the Tifosi, I'm going to throw Ferrari a bone here and I'm going to call them winners. And you might be thinking I'm being overly generous here, but considering that on Saturday and Sunday morning, they were staring in the face of the prospect of having 0 points to their name with 11th and 12th, they managed to come away with 20. And Hamilton nearly got a podium. So that was quite spirited, because he was right on Oscar's tail. Even though the car itself isn't in a place to be regularly hunting for podiums at the moment, that could change for Spain though, Hamilton though, starting on the harder tyres, he made steady progress throughout the field, and had fantastic good luck with his stops, and then felt great, he said, as he swooped past Leclerc down the start-finish straights in the final laps of the race. And he did that in Italy, in front of the Tifosi. And you might be thinking that, oh, well, yeah, he shouldn't have qualified in that position. You're right, he absolutely shouldn't, neither should have Leclerc. But the fact is, though, he got up to 4th. It will energise him as well, and the Tifosi. It's not the start of a true fight back yet, but coming back from 12th to 4th, that's still noteworthy. Leclerc's race, though? Yikes, that was frustrating to watch. Sure, he had a decent start of himself, but all the good fortune Lewis got with timings and pit stops, Charles didn't have nearly as much of. The radio played out a very angry Leclerc with himself and the team, whilst Hamilton's demeanour was far more measured. It almost felt like the script had been flipped or something like that. Lewis was the more composed one. And then on top of that, he narrowly escaped being under investigation by the stewards after his little tangle with Alex Albon. I think ultimately that was the right thing to do to give the position back, because had they remained firm and there had been a 5-second penalty after that safety car near the end, Leclerc could have been down in like 8. And even though they did show good resilience and teamwork and the strategy was absolutely brilliant, given what they had and the C6 actually making strategies matter for once, even though it was a one-stop, they still got to fix their qualifying situation. Over a lap, that car is still not good enough. But they have closed in on Mercedes in second place because Russell only got 8, Ferrari 20. That would have been a huge boost to everyone in Maranello. Before we carry on, I would like to thank Surfshark for sponsoring this video. I'd like you to imagine this. Supposing you're up your favourite ladder or at your favourite eatery or something. You know, just scrolling the free Wi-Fi available. Hackers love those networks, but with Surfshark protecting your rungs and your data, it encrypts your traffic so nobody can climb yours. Jump to movie night at home, your favourite ladder-themed documentaries on the telly, and then you find out, oh no, it's not available in my country. Open Surfshark, choose another nation, refresh, enjoy. Same subscription, fresh library. And one account covers an unlimited range of devices. You got your phone, you got your laptop, you even got your TV itself. And the Clean Web feature, it swats away those trackers. Visit surfshark.com/LawVS or use my code LawVS or the link in the description for an extra 4 months free, plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. Click the link and keep your precious ladder safe. Thank you. And then Williams. Not only did they get another double points finish on the bounce, but they've now scored over 50 points and we're not even finished with the first act of the season. They only need 33 more points to actually outscore what they did in 2017. Arguably, their last quote-unquote decent season. And that in of itself would mean that the dark ages, the real dark ages of Williams, are well and truly over. And do you know what I find really fascinating is that McLaren are taking notice, because in the post-race cool-down room, Oscar was heard, I think this is what I heard, said that had Alex made that move on Leclerc's stick and not taken to the gravel, Albon could have mugged Piastri on the tyres that he had, the old ones. So that could have easily been another podium since Alex was sniffing one back in Miami. That's absolutely insane to think that Williams were having a small snifter of a chance of a podium. If only Antonelli's safety car period had finished earlier, and what's more, Albon felt like that pace was real. He wasn't benefiting from luck or anything like that. Only the off-track excursion with Leclerc threw him off tempo. And what I find really, really pleasing to see is that, sure, they're stopping proper development on this year's car, but it just looks so much more stable. Science reporting that the balance has very much been rectified, it's been addressed, and I could easily see that last year's car would have not been able to pull off that kind of a move or being frisky at all. It would have been a little bit more cautious, a little bit slower, it could have been extra twitchy, or if Alex had tried to pull that manoeuvre around the outside and then taken to the gravel, he could have spun out given how crash-prone the FW46 was. Having said that though, I did recall hearing Albon saying some messages to the effect of, guys, come on, we need to snap out of it or something like that. Like they were almost paralysed to do anything, like they were wishing to just let the tyres go long and there seemed to be no strategy. So either Albon wasn't in touch with what was going on, or the pit wall, weren't communicating it to Alex properly. So there is still some work to be done there, because Carlos was saying the same thing, and he suffered a similar fate to that of Piastri. It became clear very soon on that the mediums, they were coming back to the drivers who stayed out longer, but he and Oscar were two prime examples of seeing that if a two-stop could work, and it truly didn't. And it didn't help that the safety car periods came when they did, so it exacerbated any two-stopper hopes even more. And even though he did outqualify Albon, Sainz once again found himself behind Albon and scoring fewer points. Sure, they are starting to come a little bit more regularly, so Sainz is now in the double figures. He is eventually getting towards the top 10 in terms of the scoring range, but at the same time, Albon has 40 points to Carlos's 11. That is still a big gap to overcome. The mindset of Williams is rapidly changing. James Vowles himself saying after the race they were disappointed with 14 points and a double points finish in the pocket. If you said that at the beginning of the season, heck, even a couple of races ago, they would have bitten your hand off. And that's really pleasing to see, that there's this confidence that is brewing at the Oxfordshire-based team, that there is something going on here, that this pace is real. And all they're going to do now is just get to know what they've already had, optimise it, maybe have a couple of sticky back plaster upgrades or something like that, bodge jobs. Williams could easily find themselves securing P5. I think even right now, with over 50 points, they've got 7th place at least in the bag. And what made it all the sweeter is that they were the only team to have scored meaningful points in the midfield, because Aston Martin, they didn't score anything despite having a really solid qualifying. In fact, Williams took their positions of 5th and 8th, and Haas didn't score anything, Alpine didn't score anything, even though Gasly started in the points. The only person in the midfield battle that can even come close to competing against them was Isack Hadjar in P9, and he was a winner as well because of it. Sure, it was only 2 points, but he was the only rookie to have scored this weekend, so I think he'll take that. He did feel like P7 was likely, but unfortunately, the team chose to keep him out instead of pitting, and that meant he was on older rubber, which is what Piastri had, so he got gobbled up by Russell and Sainz. Although, having said that, he didn't fall that far behind them, so he did keep within touch. He wasn't falling away rapidly. And he should feel rather chipper, because once again he outshone the likes of Liam Lawson, who in of himself didn't have a Mardy of a weekend, but nor did he have really anything noteworthy at all, whereas Isack once again proved to be really solid, the real deal. They are edging ever closer to Aston Martin, and now with Haas not scoring anything, 6th place is a lot more likely than it was just a few weeks ago. And that is all down to the handiwork of Petit Prost. And now, McLaren. As far as the team is concerned, they had a great weekend. And considering that Mercedes faltered, it means that their gap to 2nd place in the Constructors took a massive leap forward. It's getting very close to that of being double. As for the drivers though, it was a bit of a mixed bag. It could have been more. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Even though Piastri did ultimately survive and get on the podium despite starting on pole, which I did think was very likely after what we saw from last year, he got mugged. Simple as that. He had a decent getaway, sure, but he left the outside line wide open thinking that things wouldn't happen. Max Verstappen, he knows a thing or two around the circuit, having now won it 4 years in a row, and we're probably not going to be coming back to this circuit anytime soon, maybe in my lifetime or something like that. You know, Oscar, fair enough. You've learned from it. You'll learn from this, and you came out of it cleanly. You kept it very civil. And from there, it was a case of just simply misreading the C5s. Oscar being one of the main front-running people, thinking that, oh, well, these mediums are going to go off, and they did grain up a little bit, but they did come back to the drivers who stuck it out. Norris being the person to have learnt from Piastri pitting in too early to cover the likes of Russell, because he had to pit it, obviously, because he had used medium tyres. But having said that, though, you've got to look at what Oscar was able to do, cutting through the field like that, and that was something he really struggled with last year, that he would get stuck behind cars, the dirty air, he couldn't make any progress. He absolutely did. He had to work really hard to get back up to third. But it did play havoc on his tyres, and Norris benefited from all of that knowledge that he got, and both safety cars giving him ample opportunity to ultimately finish ahead of his teammate. Not too bad. That would have definitely given his psyche a bit of a boost. Now, of course, folks were wondering about whether or not McLaren would step in with team orders, especially with Norris getting on the blower saying, well, you know, I'm faster and I'm on newer tyres, so, just saying. He definitely dropped some hints there, but McLaren weren't biting. And there was an interesting comment post-race that Stella was saying that my wife picked up and then I tuned into again, saying that, according to their own data, McLaren, there wasn't enough data to prove that Norris was fast enough to enact a swap order, that they just left the two drivers to their own devices and that they would figure it out soon enough. It took Norris 3 laps to overtake Piastri on all the tyres, and make of that what you will. But the fact of the matter is, though, is that as far as McLaren are concerned, they don't care. Piastri's still leading the championship, Norris is still P2, and in terms of the constructors, they're absolutely acing it. And that's the thing about McLaren that Damon Hill made an interesting quote about, and it was saying that the drivers aren't the centre of the world at McLaren, that they are merely passing through. The team thinks of the team. And to all of those thinking that Oscar was robbed to make Lando feel good, no, I don't think so. It's just down to the fact that the strategy simply didn't work. No one was quite sure what these tyres would do. The C6, cast to the wayside, that was a quality tyre. Simple as that. The C5, let's remember, the medium was a C5 and they still do break down, but then it suddenly came back to them. What's this going to mean for future races with the C5? If they go through a graining spell, it might come back again. Maybe used a bit more frequently. Ooh, think about that. And then we get to the meh section with Yuki Tsunoda. He had to dig deep after a pit lane start, brought on from his crash in Q1, which did look really terrifying. As many people in my comments on across various social media pointed out, he was emulating the likes of Italian Jesus, who I think in 2020 did something similar to get back into P10. And Hornet, that's what he told Yuki that he was supposed to do for the race, get back into the points and all, and he did. So he followed instruction. He also played the team game. He briefly held up Oscar Piastri, which would have been really beneficial in making sure the gap was big enough in case Max came in. He ultimately didn't, but Tsunoda was able to play his part some way. He was still frustrated by his qualifying crash, though, admitting that he made a big mistake at what is his second home race since he doesn't live too far away from this track, as well as his native Japan, and he also admits that he needs to adapt quickly to avoid more tough weekends and have better qualifying. And that is a fairly valid point to make, because had he been able to get into Q3, or at least be in the top end of Q2, he would have probably been scoring a little bit more in terms of points, and really giving the Williams a bit of trouble, and potentially taking even more points away from Mercedes, maybe finishing ahead of Russell to really rub salt into the wound for Toto, who was not present at this particular weekend. Because may I remind you, Red Bull is slowly getting closer to Mercedes for second place in the Constructors. Even though they're not thinking about that, Horner's saying they're really focused on the driver's title. But Yuki, in his own little small way, is playing his part, but he does need to do more. But he is justifying the promotion still. Just. Then Fernando Alonso, and this was tragic for him, really tragic. He finally saw some real pace from his car, especially on race day, when he ran in the thick of the points for most of the afternoon. And these upgrades for the Imola Grand Prix, unlike last year, actually worked. And then they had big brain time by using the C5s in all 3 sessions for their final run, which ultimately got them those really good top 10 qualifying positions, with Stroll in P8 and Alonso 5th, his highest qualifying position since China last year. It looked like they turned a corner, that maybe what I'd mentioned in my Aston Martin video from last week of Adrian Newey just casting a few little chatettes over lunch with the AMR25 team might have borne some fruit, but unfortunately it wasn't meant to be. And as Fernando put it, he was going through a lot of torture in the second half of the race, which made him the unluckiest driver in the bleeping world. And that was really sad to see, because he had it. Even though he is approaching 45, this guy's still got it. That he's not washed, that for a while he was just mildly soaked. Because it didn't work out for him in the race, nor did it Stroll. And yeah, I'm sorry, Fernando, you're not the unluckiest driver in the world. That's Charles. But never mind. The lack of points wasn't down to not having any pace, it was just down to a lot of misfortune. So therefore, I can't make Fernando Alonso a loser, not at all, because he really did a lot today and he looked really, really chipper, and it looked like he could have easily at least gotten a couple of points, which for Aston Martin would have been fan-dabby-dozy considering Haas weren't scoring any, and then also would have been good for him to finally have some points to his name, which the fact that he doesn't have any is an absolute crime. And then Nico Hülkenberg. And it's not every day I put a Sauber not in the loser section at the moment, but Hülkenberg left Imola with mixed emotions after a race where he did show flashes of competitiveness, but ultimately finished just outside the points. Because at the beginning, they put him on the hard tyres much like Hamilton, and he was making some really good traction. At one point, I saw him for a good few laps in P10, and it looked like they might have been able to snag that one extra point, which might have put them equal in points with Alpine. And they weren't troubling the points anytime soon. But unfortunately, they didn't really benefit from all of the safety car period. Nico was kept out for a little bit too long, they were clinging onto the one stop, and then he got gobbled up for P10, he finished 12th. I think Sauber can take plenty of positives from this weekend, that they actually seemed rather gutsy, that Jonathan Wheatley's presence is going to be really held tightly by them, in that gave them the balls to put Gabriel Bortoleto down at the end of the pit lane, even though the FIA hadn't made their formal decision, because they were that confident in the rules. Because remember, Wheatley is one of the guys who made what Michael Masi did happen because he knew the rulebook so well. And that was shown with Sauber having this level of confidence. Hülkenberg felt like there was more in the tank. This is one of his better weekends. So I do think that Sauber can get some more points, but it's going to have to take that Barcelona upgrade to make it happen. The pace is there, especially on the hard C4s. And I also think that Nico will feel quite happy because he managed to overcome his teammate who had outqualified him. And speaking of Alpine, they start off the losers. Because this was not the best first weekend in charge for Flavio Briatore, although the documents from the FIA technically don't list him as the team principal. But come on, he is. Dave Greenwood, even though on paper he's the team principal, he's mainly like the team representative, like Alessandro Aluni-Bravi was for Sauber. So in tradition, I am going to misremember Blue Forest's name, and I've got things to keep up. We have customs here on this channel. And the dream start for Franco Colapinto at a track he really holds dear to his name, that didn't happen. So with all of those fond memories, he's got a really bad one at the same time, so it all balances out. Which I feel really bad for Franco, because there was so much pressure on his shoulders, and then all of the antics that were happening offline, that didn't help either, so he had to get on the blower to keep them under control. And sure, Pierre did make it to Q3, so there was something in the tank, and he did make up a place at the start, but then he was having an argy-bargy with his bestie Leclerc. They were duking it out, and then ultimately, Pierre just stayed a little bit too wide, he got on the gravel, and then he ultimately fell down to P14. And it was a real clear example that all of these drivers take for granted the huge amounts of runoff, and that gravel, it really does bite you. I mean, at least Franco kept it clean in the race, and for a long time he was only a few seconds behind Pierre, and he did orchestrate a swap position quite cleanly, so he is a team player, because quite frankly, Flavio has conveniently forgotten, using his senility, did you go, the 5 years limit for Franco, I didn't say that, you imagine that thing. It's like, no, there is no time limit from Franco, I absolutely knew it. That was a cover-up to make Jack feel a little bit better about himself. That's the truth. And maybe to keep the sponsors honest, but Franco, he ain't going anywhere. The Italians see something in this kid. And as for Oliver Oakes, well, he was back in charge over at High Tech, and that team had a really solid weekend with Dino Bogdanovic getting his first pole in F2, and a far better time than Alpine did, so that was awkward. And then Mercedes. This was not the weekend they wanted either, especially since they were introducing their first big upgrade package of the season. Sure, George did take a leaf out of Aston Martin's playbook and got P3 in qualifying ahead of Norris, which made it look like he was going to be getting yet another podium, but then the Imola Grand Prix turned out to be a place where you could really overtake quite well. It wasn't dull at all. And ultimately, one of the bugbears of the W15 reared its ugly head again, the matter of the rear tyres overheating due to the fact that it was a little bit warmer than the weather forecasts were predicting. George at some points was complaining that the rear just felt completely disconnected to the car, that maybe something had broke. And that is going to be really concerning considering that this was the first big package and they were really pinning it on them catching up with McLaren, but instead they fell backwards behind Red Bull with only P7 to Russell's name. But at least he was able to finish, because for Kimi's first home Grand Prix, it was really bittersweet. Yes, he started behind the Ferraris in 13th, that wasn't great, but he did manage to get past Hamilton, keeping him at bay for a while, on a differing run plan. But then of course he had that throttle issue which saw him to retire, and he caused the second safety car, and that would have been really, really galling, especially since we're probably not going to be going back to Imola anytime soon due to the fact, well, the cars are outgrowing the track, the investment isn't there, and there are so many other circuits which are calling for the dibs, and we don't want to be seeing the calendar getting any bigger. Put simply, it wasn't the dream ending that he wanted to his time with F1 and this track, and also to show his classmates, which he invited to the Mercedes camp for the whole weekend, and then playing football in the grounds whilst Toto wasn't around to tell them off, saying, "Ah, you pesky kids, get off my lawn!" But fortunately, the team were able to study this, and in time for Monaco, it may not be as much of an issue, since the tyres aren't nearly tested as much as they would have been around Imola. But the fact that a W15 issue came back again, right when the groove is really good with Mercedes and Red Bull are closing in on them, the timing wasn't great, come on. And then my boy Gabi. Yeah, I could feel the comments are ready to tear into me based on my Thursday video, I'm not gonna lie, it was a rough one for him here. I mean, a crash from FP1 didn't help, even though he did actually finish that session in the top 10, showing that there was potential in there. And according to his race comments, the hard tyres, the C4s, were really good for him as well. He was able to hold on to 14th place around that time, and in Q2 he did get into there and he showed some pace. He wasn't far behind Antonelli and the two Ferraris. But unfortunately, and this is something really important to stress here, Bortoleto was handicapped by the team ultimately putting him on a 3-stop strategy compared to Nico's 1-stop strategy. You serious? 3? This isn't the 2000s! You can't get away with a 3-stop when a 2-stop proved to be too daring. And that is why I reckon Bortoleto finished 18th. At least he was honest about this being a total challenge and that this was something for him to overcome, and Nico ultimately was the closer of the two to scoring points, even though he did outqualify the German. But yes, he saw the nasty side of the two safety car stints, so I just felt like I needed to point it out here because the comments, even from people from his native Brazil, they're not very kind to Gabi right now, so I just want to say that there was a good reason for this, that, yeah, you lose 30 seconds because of that pit stop, which ultimately turned out to not really give you anything in return. And then Lance Stroll, who finished 15th. Like Fernando, he did show promise in qualifying, but unlike his teammate, he didn't finish close to the points by the time the race ended, with him being also a victim of the safety cars. Not the first time we've heard that now, isn't it? And ultimately, he finished ahead of Colapinto, who looked like he was about to be pipped by the Argentinian. So yeah, Stroll's season continues to remain stop-start, and with these upgrades there will be that little bit more pressure to provide some good feedback for the AMR25 team, and for Newey to chew over a spot of luncheon. Yes, his bringing home of the bacon and all 14 points to Aston Martin's name just served him well, but that performance from Alonso just now showed that he's ready to bring home some bacon himself and could easily turn the tides around, so Stroll needs to step up now. He's had a good start to the season, relatively speaking, but he does need to actually capitalise on that a little bit more and stop the likes of Alpine and Racing Bulls catching up with them and seeing maybe Aston Martin fall down to the depths of 9th. The team are reportedly saying that maybe there was a good reason for why Lance was so off the pace, that maybe there was some kind of mistake with the setup, but the fact remains though is that out of the two drivers, the Spaniard was the stronger. Much like how over at Racing Bulls, it was the Frenchman who was stronger of the two, with Liam not having anything to show for this weekend, one of the few drivers to actually have that said about them. He was kind of anonymous. And what made this extremely frustrating for the New Zealander is that the pace was there, because Hadjar scored points. He could have easily got 7th had the strategies been favourable to him. Liam just simply didn't have anything to offer. He was just there. And sure, you might be thinking, well, that's better than the last few races where he was there and causing trouble and mischief. But then we also have to get to the situation which Helmut Marko and the Red Bull Junior team will be assessing him and what's going on in F2. You might be thinking I'm being harsh here, comparing him and thinking that he's got something dangling over him, but that's just the ethos of Red Bull at the moment. So I'm only just saying what they're probably thinking. Because you got Arvid Lindblad in F2 having a fantastic Imola weekend, surging past Pepe Marti in the standings to be P5 in the championship. And even though in terms of super license points it doesn't matter, the higher he goes, the more likely Liam Lawson's career is about to be axed. Because put simply, Lindblad is Red Bull's Antonelli. They want to get him in there as soon as possible for him to be a long-term prospect and bastion and maybe future leader. Hadjar may be there as well, Tsunoda may be transient, so in the next few years we might have Lindblad and Hadjar leading Red Bull Racing. I mean, if it all goes well and the trajectories continue to go where they're going. Team boss Laurent Mekies did, though, in Liam's defence, admit that the timing just simply didn't work out for him, and emphasising that there was speed there with the Kiwi, it just wasn't tapped into. But if Marko doesn't see that speed translate into points soon, I don't think it will even matter, despite whatever good words Mekies has to say about his drivers. And there wasn't much good to say about Haas because this was terrible for them. Now 31 points behind Williams. You are going to need a consistent run of finishes whilst Williams scores nada, and then maybe you're going to have a Brazil Alpine 2024 situation where you get 30 points in one go. Because a reliability issue cost the team again. And in this era of Formula 1, this is a really big issue because all the other teams aren't really complaining about this all too often, save for the occasional snafu like Aston Martin had with Alonso in China. Haas has now had 2 in a row, because Esteban Ocon's engine suffocated effectively. Even though he did make up a good few places at the start, there was something to cheer about. Ultimately, though, it wasn't to be for the Frenchman, and Behrman was stuck down in P19. He made up a couple of places to finish 17th on the road. There just wasn't really much to smile about, and now they're having to maybe shift what their targets are. Williams, I think they're gone for now, unless all the other teams can catch up to them. They're not going to be thinking what Aston Martin are doing, what Racing Bulls are doing, maybe what Alpine's doing, because Aston Martin gave them the spook, because had those two, Alonso and Stroll, secured a top 10 finish with those same positions, they would have gone past Haas immediately. Think about that. And you need to think a lot about Aston Martin, because according to Adrian Newey's first big interview since joining the team, there's a lot to be happy about. To find out about some of the other comments Adrian Newey made about the team and why there is a lot to be hopeful for, watch this video next straight after this one. And thanks once again to Surfshark for sponsoring today's video.